waiting room to start popping, but I am incorrect. Absolutely. Now we are being live streamed, and it is on the way that we will have an audience. The waiting room to start popping.
All right, here we go.
Like crap. Everybody's here.
That's fun. Hi, Shannon.
Oops.
Hi.
Will the real
Actual
Shannon
Shannon.
please stand up?
Hello, guys. Thank you, and welcome to Writer's Lunch. We're happy to have y'all here. And that it's the end of July because that means summer is almost on the way over. We still have at least a month, if not two, because we are in Texas.
Just means that summer's just starting up.
Oh, really?
August is the
Really?
worst.
I think August feels like the worst. I saw an article the other day that was like, why does summer feel like winter now? Because everybody just stays inside because it's hotter than it was. And I was like, are you
Oh,
new? Are you new? The seasonal depression down here is in the summer, not the winter.
well,
It's too hot to do anything.
yeah. I have noticed that. I have gotten a lot of seasonal depression in the summer now that I think about it.
I am such a masochist for going out like when it's 95 and taking a walk or going out to a park or something. But I feel like just that being in the sun is what matters. It's just, oh boy, it's not fun. Oh yes, Anna, always taking that walk. Good on you to keep on a schedule.
It is hot.
All right. Well, so this week, everyone, please say hello to returning champion Ian Michael Everett. He will be talking about breaking out of the medieval fantasy Europe and different fun fantasy settings that you can and should be using, as well as why is medieval Europe so popular.
Mm.
But before we get started with that, next week, please join us as Shannon will be talking about doing market research for your book, which is a very important part of the publishing process, whether you're self-publishing or going to an agent, you really need to know what else is out there and what that means for your book.
Cool.
Take it away, Ian.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Breaking Out of Medieval Fantasy Europe, a totally unnecessary topic to address, but I thought it'd be fun anyway. Mostly because I think a lot of books nowadays are exploring places beyond medieval fantasy Europe, and I'm going to highlight quite a few of those today. But I think it is important to note some things about, where fantasy comes from, why it has adhered to these tropes, these settings, these trappings a for a while now. But first, before we start conversing, a little bit about me. As Daphne said, I'm a returning champion, editor with the Tomeworks Editing Collective. I'm a Houston-based fantasy and sci-fi writer. I have written a superhero web serial called the Megajewel series under its former name Inheritors. It was a top 50 of all time web serial on top web fiction. I love to play D&D. I play entirely too much, but it is very fun for mm, I find it's really good for story, your improvisational skills. It can help you with drafting. And I also do stuff for Muay Thai, so if you ever need any fight advice, I got you. So, welcome to my talk. I want to open it up with a question today, but and ask you, what's the last book that you read that broke the kind of common fantasy mold of Western European medieval fantasy?
Iron Widow.
Iron Widow?
Actually, that's not my most recent. Anna and I read The Undertaking of Heart and Mercy, which
Hmm.
is a fantasy romance that is definitely second world, but feels much more like modern day.
I also have just read Witch King. I see people saying that.
There are so many that are in fantasy. So like, the one that I'm reading right now, Bookstops and Bone Dust. It's a cozy fantasy, but yeah, it sticks in the genre very much. So even though we've had kind of an explosion of people going outside of The genre still, what do you say? 85% is still medieval fantasy style? Absolutely.
Well, that not only that, but it also is still the fantasy that dominates culturally. It's when people think of fantasy, they think of art, knights and armor and dragons, kings, queens, medieval feudalism. This kind of, as we will discuss, pastiche illusion that we have made of medieval Europe. Um, but so, why medieval fantasy? Well, first of all, fantasy as a modern genre finds a lot of its foundations in Tolkien. And Lord of the Rings is still considered a classic of not only fantasy, but pretty much of all literature. It is up there, consistently ranked with many of the high pieces of literature. And it is also considered, many people credit it as the forefather of modern fantasy. I'm not going to dispute that. I think so much of what I've done and why I got into fantasy has been informed by Tolkien. His approach to creating his world and languages was very much based in a desire to create a mythology for England. He'd seen where other mythologies came from, and he was very interested in crafting something similar for England. And this isn't exactly a stated goal, but it is kind of inferred from many of his correspondences. He was a professor of uh, Germanic languages, and this informed his world building. Uh, he is a lot of the reason that we have what we have now, but it's not the entire story. So medieval fantasy, and I think fantasy in general, has a deep influence in the genre from Gothic, Romantic, and Victorian art that depicted medieval life in a sort of nostalgic, rose-tinted view as the Industrial Revolution came about and life modernized, things sped up really fast. They started to get this kind of pastoral view of medieval feudalism that serfs had it good, that life was slower. And we actually still repeat some of these myths or perhaps factoids today where, people talk about how much we work compared to serfs or how good their dental hygiene and bathing was compared to us or something like that. Um, Not really, just things that have been kind of influenced by this romantic view of medieval history. But it only bears kind of a passing resemblance to actual medieval European history. There's also another factor, the ease of use. It is an easy language to speak, especially if you've been reading. If you've read Lord of the Rings, if you've read A Song of Ice and Fire, if you've read, widely in the fantasy genre, a lot of it is going to be calling on trappings, plots, settings, that draw on Western canon. They draw on Arthurian legend. They draw on Tolkien. And it's these sources are very ingrained in Western fantasy to this day. It's not just easy to use, it is a cultural lingo that has been used since Tolkien. Um, Seeing comments here. We also have, and to that point, there's this kind of marketing inertia, right? The Western audience and Western publishers have developed a kind of symbiotic relationship on what is produced and what is consumed. It's not gatekeeping people like twirling their mustaches or whatever, going, I will only ever publish, A Song of Ice and Fire clones or stuff like that. But it is seeing a trend that is in culture, whereas in, American culture, remember the wild heights that A Song of Ice and Fire reached, like the craze that happened because of the show, and then the books exploded again, and they were already very popular. Um, I think that publishers see that. A lot of writers see that and they say, well, if that's what gets attention, that's what makes money, then that's what I'm going to do. That's where I'm going to put my effort in creating a story. Even D&D, which is, an incredibly popular TTRPG, probably the most popular TTRPG, is heavily influenced at its foundation by medieval low fantasy, although there are fringes where they have other genre influences. But I've just read actually the DM handbook that they put out in 2024 for D&D, and many of the subgenres they mention when you're writing campaigns is they're specifically fantasy subgenres, and they're specifically going to be epic fantasy, swords and sorcery, dark fantasy, um, things that are kind of drawing from the medieval pastiche. So, how do we get out of this? How do we find new sources of inspiration that don't involve an inaccurate romantic view of medieval Western European fantasy? Uh, I have always had this rule uh, that you've heard the rule, write what you know. I think that's a pretty common bit of advice that is bandied about in writing circles. And I like to invert it. I like to have the phrase know what you write. That has been probably a guiding principle for me. And when I write stuff, I want to do research and look up how things work. And bring that sort of authentic, knowledge of a situation into it. So if you're writing medieval fantasy, you have this kind of, it's easy, right? You know what you're writing. But I think this is a good rule to apply to many other places. So we're going to look at a couple of areas where we can get out of medieval fantasy and explore other genres, explore other cultural influences, other settings that I think will be interesting. So, the first kind of area I want to talk about is cultural. And I think, this is a pretty easy first kind of steps to make. Um, Drawing on other cultures besides Western Europe. Uh, Sean talked about traveling and doing field work. I believe so in one of his previous, was it last week?
Yeah, that was just last week, man. You want
Yeah.
to know about traveling? Go check out our YouTube channel and our Last Alive, how you can learn all about other places. And yes, Ian, I highly advocate for bringing them to fantasy as well. Oh, you're reminding me of other things, actually. I got to put some more fantasy that is non-Western into the chat.
Yeah, go for it. Um, So, but exploring other cultures, drawing on global sources, various mythologies, the world is wider than the Anglo-Saxons, is basically the point. But doing the academic legwork of looking up and researching, cultures that you find fascinating, interesting to draw on to inform your world building. And I'm not saying here, just make your fantasy setting Asian, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying and I'll talk about this in a second, but more so what I'm saying is be informed by a variety of cultures and how they answered the various questions of life. That can help you look at your world building a little differently. So, as I said, read up, do your research. Wikipedia should be not your final point. A lot of people just go to Wikipedia and get the summary, and that's that, rather than investigating some of the sources that some of these writers draw from. Try to find, published works that are, peer-reviewed, academically sound on various cultural sources. You can read nonfiction, fiction alike, read fiction from the authors of the culture that you are interested in investigating. Read mythologies and folklore. I've got a big old book of various worldly folklore that I like to read and just to look and see what, the different kinds of myths that have come up from different parts of the world, to look at what's similar and what's different. Don't do a caricature of a culture. I think it's pretty easy to say, like I said, to make your fantasy setting Asian and then fall into a lot of stereotypes and end up writing something that's kind of racist or very racist. Um, and not really nuanced or in depth at all. You don't want to draw on cultures and repeat the mistake that we've done with medieval Europe times. I'm so sorry. My dog is going berserk. If y'all could give me 2 seconds. Yep. John, edit that out. Just kidding.
Oh, it wasn't long enough to edit. You're perfectly fine.
Yeah, no, that's all right. But yes, don't repeat the mistake of, what we've done kind of with medieval times is draw on this very inaccurate pastiche just because it's easy. What I like to say is frame it in terms of the big cultural questions. How do we deal with food, with death, with social cohesion, marriage, love, religion? All of these things have had so many different answers from different cultures. Don't be afraid to pull on some of these. Don't be afraid to, look at various places' answers to some of these questions and use that to, when you're world building, write your own answers to these. Um, and also don't be afraid to explore weirder concepts. I'm a really big fan of Jeff Vandermeer, and he is really good at writing stories that are influenced by alien biology and how that looks and um what that is what that could be like, that it makes his worlds feel more alien, but very interesting to explore. Definitely also hire a sensitivity reader if you are drawing on a specific culture that you are not from. Don't, that can help you avoid the pitfalls of caricature, of racist stereotyping. They'll tell you, hey, this is an incorrect view. It's not accurate. And if you are from the culture, if you are from whatever you're writing about, like for instance, if you are a West African writer writing about West African mythology, it can always be helpful to just have a sensitivity reader, another set of eyes to kind of help you draw out, if you are writing about your culture in some way, it can help. But typically, this is something I'd recommend more for someone like me looking to draw on inspiration from other cultures. Uh, Rhonda, I see you're talking about use of heavy horses, and I do want to talk about technology in a second. That is going to be one of the areas I'd like to explore as a setting differentiator. But right now we're talking about culture. So one thing that I really like, there is a big questionnaire out there called Dr. Zahir's Ethnographical Questionnaire, and it's a wonderful tool for world builders, fantasy writers trying to build, secondary world cultures. You can see an example of some of the questions that I thought, that are in the questionnaire on the website. And it helps you inform what your culture looks like. You can look at, questions of place, like where they are, how does their climate and their geography inform society? What are the natural disasters that might have influenced the way that they live? And a great example of this, AP and I both read very well. I read, I think AP read it a while ago. I read the Broken Earth trilogy, which was absolutely about a society that is weighed upon by constant climate disasters caused by tectonic shifting. And just that simple idea, right, of answering that question could inform an entire world, an entire trilogy of books. I do like, Ryan, what you're saying. Keep in mind that other cultures also have a very romanticized view of their past. Definitely. Um, AP, I think you and I were saying the same thing. You can invent something new based on your understanding of people and culture. It doesn't have to be European inspired or Asian inspired, but you could look at some of these questions and see how European people answered them versus East Asian people versus West African versus Russian, Slavic sources. Uh, these are all interesting. You can look to their answers to some of these questions as inspiration for answering them on your own. I don't think you should crib their entire homework, though. I think that's when you get into trouble. Oh, sorry. Uh, yeah, Sean, you mentioned Eastern European. I'd call that, Slavic. That's a source. There's Polish and then there's Russian. And Polish is very much, The Witcher is very emblematic uh, of that culture. Uh, but I have a couple of examples if you want some recommended reading. N.K. Jemison's Dreamblood duology has Egyptian inspired. Madeline Miller's works tend to be retellings of Greek myths. Throne of the Crescent Moon by Saladin Ahmed, Middle Eastern. Uh, Children of Blood and Bone, Atomi Adeyemi is a West African inspired. Jade City by Fonda Lee is East Asian inspired, and also that book shows up on other places in this list as we talk about technology and such. Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. It's Mexican inspired. Deathless by Catherine Valente. Slavic inspired. And obviously, Sean, you've mentioned the Polish Witcher, which would be very interesting. But there's this is just me pulling like some of the more popular works that are recommended when you say, how do I read outside of my, cultural Western fantasy stuff. So some of these books would be very interesting to pick up and see. Um, and I tried to pick works that were not by just a random white male author being inspired by the culture, and I tried to pick authors that were more in the heritage of what they were writing. But I did want to look at Dr. Zahir's
Yeah, you put it in the right spot and everything.
yeah. I did, thank you.
Sorry about that. Talking to Clover.
No, you're good. So can y'all see the ethnographical questionnaire? Cool. So it has a lot of
zoom
really...
in for the text, bud.
What? Oh yeah,
Zoom in for the text.
Yep. No, wrong one. Zooming in on the wrong area. So you have a lot of really interesting questions that you can answer, and I did. There is a link, but you can just look up the. Here, I'll put. Actually, I think I can just copy this link. If you ever want to just go through it with your world building, how do people travel? What resource is it most lacking? A lot of people, I see this on fantasy subreddit sometimes, like, what if my world didn't have gunpowder? And like, how would that influence things? This is an interesting question to ask yourself when you are world building is, not necessarily what if my world didn't have it, but what if like a particular area that my story is focusing on, those people, and that culture, that area did not have tin, for example. And you can look to history to see what that actually looked like. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit because I've been reading a lot about the Bronze Age, and I've been very wanting to write something that is set in that age because I think it's fascinating. But questions of time. How far back do they record their history? How do they record their history? What are they afraid of happening? You tap into these kind of interesting questions. What are their most popular stories? Who is their greatest hero or their worst villain? Um, Sex and family, how do they decide how to have to pair up or romance? Does that even factor into it? What happens to children? How are they raised? These are all like the fundamental questions of being human. You can look to so many different places to try to answer that. But I definitely recommend going through, they even cover faith, religion, government, economics, war. It's just so many different so many different questions that can be helpful to your world building, and you can look to different places and how they answered them. And I think that goes a little bit deeper than just being like, yes, my work is Asian inspired, or my work is inspired by Slavic mythology or whatever. It helps you get more into that mindset of, where they're at and why and what they're doing. Because I think what a lot of people forget is these things just don't exist in a vacuum, right? We do things for a reason, and there is often something that is informing why something is the way it is in culture. As as Kamala Harris said, you exist in the context of all that came before you. Um, so I think that is a something to consider when you were looking to draw on cultural influences. So, that is not the only pillar that I think we should look at when getting out of medieval fantasy. So I'm talking about West European medieval fantasy. And the second tenet of that is medieval, which is kind of time period, technological age. And I've seen people in the chat already kind of talking about how the horse influenced things, how for example, serfs did work less than us, but homemaking was a much bigger affair, because they didn't have the technology to address a lot of the ways to make homes, the way we do now. So drawing on other ages besides medieval ages, history is long. Medieval history is actually a relatively short part of it. You can look to other time periods and technological eras. Urban fantasy, as Daphne just said, it's a very popular subgenre. I think it's probably the most popular subgenre of fantasy outside of like, the main epic one. Um, it is, you mix modern technology, real world locale, and supernatural elements. That is also very easy. As Daphne has said, there's way less research. I tomorrow, if I wanted to, I could write a fantasy story about Houston. That would be so easy for me because I live here and I know it and I know, what it's like. But I don't think we should just be limited to that either. So I'm going to look at some other places that we can draw influence from. But again, read up, do your research, read nonfiction, histories, academic documents that detail the time period and technology level that you're interested in. Um, I find that researching, if I have questions, this isn't like an authorial source, but I really like the Ask Historians subreddit if I ever have a specific question about, something technological or, you know, I've been reading a lot about the Bronze Age recently because I was really fascinated by it. And reading about people's answers to why did the Bronze Age collapse, what is going on, what was the culture like back then, how did they recover from the collapse, why bronze over other metals, that kind of thing. um do your reading, or find your sources. I really do like to find, for me, I really love a good YouTube video, as long as it's properly sourced. So just turning it on and listening to somebody talk about it. Um, Actually, and another fun thing you could do is familiarize yourself with it, right? Like you could, for instance, if you if you want to do gunpowder fantasy, there are plenty of videos of people playing around with muskets. It might be a little cost prohibitive to go out and explore every kind of different level of tech, but I do recommend, if you want to. If you want to get familiar with these things, do your research, see how, look up like the Townsends is a great YouTube source that talks about what life was like during the early colonial age and what, as particularly from a food perspective, which I find very interesting, what they made to eat, and how you can see a lot of the early cuisine that led to what we eat today in America. Um, you can see how the fantasy elements might influence the tech level. Ask yourself those questions. A Song of Ice and Fire actually uses magic calamity as a justification to freeze history in a medieval stasis. I appreciate what Westeros is. It is obviously the default of what we're talking about getting away from, but it is a good example of saying, but what if, what if there was something else? What if a magical calamity was causing a world that is stuck in the Bronze Age to constantly collapse backwards and then recrawl themselves back up and collapse backwards? That would be a very interesting kind of setting. Or humans could not even get beyond the Neolithic Stone Age, stuck, just wielding, stone axes and chipping things off. Um, very in, that could be an interesting setting. There's a lot in different levels of technology that you can explore that are not just knights in armor. Um, I think people tend to get stuck on that and they don't look at how things were even advancing. Like for instance, the Song of Ice and Fire seems stuck in stasis, but in real medieval history, the plate armor was king until, new advancements in weaponry made it so that it wasn't, until the English longbow came about or you could arm a lot of people in a short amount of time compared to putting someone in full plate armor. Um, these are the kinds of things that you can look at and see how they displace things. As the advancement of technology, that can be a story engine in and of itself. So I do have some recommended readings here as well. I've got some various different ages, time periods that have inspired some of these works, like the Chronicles of Ancient Darkness, which is a prehistoric book, prehistoric fantasy. His Majesty's Dragon, which I've been reading by Naomi Novik, which is an alt history Napoleonic era, but it is still a fantasy in that it has dragons. Um, Wizard of Earthsea, little known fact, is actually a Bronze Age story. It is set, I believe Ged's father is a bronze worker, which is kind of fascinating. But however, the story focus is not on the bronze, but it is an element of it, and it kind of informs their. Obviously, Earthsea has a very naval setting, so there's a lot of sailing and emphasis on that as well. The Dresden Files, pretty standard urban fantasy pick, but however, Daphne, I know you love urban fantasy. Would you like to make any better recommendations than me, who is not very well read in the genre?
I mean, better or
I don't know about whatever you
no.
would rather recommend.
I mean, Mercedes Lackey is definitely at the forefront for me. 100% recommend anything she's ever written. I also love Patricia Briggs, but that's getting into kind of werewolf fiction, um, which is a big staple of the urban fantasy scene. But yeah, Mercedes Lackey for sure.
Mhm. I did include a interesting kind of look at cave art. The Mind in the Cave by David Lewis Williams is just kind of an analysis of cave art and how that led to consciousness and our long history of art started there, right? People putting handprints on a cave wall. Another one, Renaissance era, which I believe Daphne you said I'm struggling to think of the difference between Renaissance and medieval. Medieval, I would say, is largely probably much more characterized by Dark Age thought, by kind of low, a little bit lower technology, while Renaissance would be more Enlightenment era. You'd probably be seeing different philosophical strains in the way people think.
Yeah, it has been a hot minute since I studied any kind of European history.
Yeah. And that's the thing
I,
that I find, kind of interesting of like, you know, as this shorthand, there's a lot more fascinating material to draw from than the shorthand that we've kind of recently been, or not recently, but historically been using.
I think when you get towards Renaissance, you actually end up in some of the like punk genres. Like you're not
Mhm.
quite Gaslamp, but a lot of stuff that would be like medieval and like clockwork kind of things. What do you think of like Da Vinci? Really hits into the tropes for that. So you're more likely to find things that are medieval setting wise, like when you look towards punks versus like fantasy, even though they're both under that same umbrella.
Do we have any recommendations for a like conventionally popular steampunk fantasy? Because
Hmm.
I like steampunk, I do, but I'm trying to think of the last time any traditional publisher went for a pure steampunk.
What's the one where the big cities eat each other?
Mortal Engines.
Mortal
Yeah,
Engines.
I think is
Yeah.
that
Anna,
steampunk?
you tied me, but actually you wrote it, so you beat me.
I think we were all thinking the same thing though. But yeah, I think that's the last one I can think of that's like really mainstream. I don't know how steampunk it is, but I think that's the
That's
idea.
pretty steampunk.
Yeah. Steampunk sometimes gets blended into other genres, I feel, than just fantasy. It kind of has its own tropes. Diesel punk I have not seen a lot of out there. I did want to write some diesel punk at some point. I think Shannon's read some of my diesel punk work back in the day, but that is one that I feel like it doesn't get explored a lot. Although Mad Max is a good example. Um,
We should do a writer's lunch on all the punks.
all the
Have we
punks.
done?
I feel like Sean did that before. Maybe we need to have him come back and do it again.
Yeah. So I'm gonna move on from technological age, but I think for me that one's the one that I was most interested in. Just because I think that is a really excellent area to mine that people tend to less so the cultural stuff because I do see fantasy branching out a lot from that, but I don't see fantasy branching out a super ton amount backwards from medieval levels of technology that I'd be more fascinated to see. So that's why I've been thinking about writing in the Bronze Age. But let's move on to genre. This is the last of my three pillars of how do I get away from Western European medieval fantasy. Western European, we get away by exploring other cultures. Medieval, we get away from it by exploring other eras of time. And then fantasy, we get away from it, although we are probably wanting to stay within it somehow by exploring other genres. And there are a myriad of genres, subgenres, and niches that are all super ample sources to draw from. Their plot lines, their characters, their archetypes, their trappings, the plot movement they follow, their stylings. You could read very widely and find so many different kinds of plot lines. I know Kurt Vonnegut has like a simple like he's like everyone does these plots. Um, but I do think that if you read pretty widely, you will see a lot of the different genre expectations. Um, if you look in fantasy's nooks and crannies, but also in other genres like horror, sci-fi, and romance, you can see what might fit in your story. You can take us beyond, I think, a lot of people still like this trope. I say the chosen one farmer boy, but really what I'm talking about is the hero's journey, which serves as a template for a lot of fantasy, even fantasy, I think that is trying to break out of uh the fantasy genre or the European medieval trappings. They still tend to fall into a lot of times the hero's journey because well it's a good template and it's very easy to do. It's pretty iconic. It's very long lasting. People still love reading stories about the hero's journey. But I do think there are other, plot movements that we could look at, we can draw on. Um, a lot of my advice today has been uh devolving into be wide read. So I'm just gonna say do your research, read up, read authors in a wide variety of genres, not just fantasy, but also read, if you can, find some nonfiction books on genre analysis and critique. People talking about the histories of genres. That'll help you find more authors to read. It'll help you understand how culture might have influenced genre and why certain genres are more popular during certain times. For example, Rhonda, you talk about in these times we feel like we need heroes. Um, I'm going to talk about next August the return of Boy Scout, which I think is very prominent right now with Superman being super popular again. We really would love some morally upstanding heroes. Why some of these things are very popular can inform why you would choose a certain genre to write about. Um, but my main point is to read a lot of different genres and then be intentional when you are setting up your story, when you are looking at it. I think a lot of people tend to write a story, and I know I've done this so many times, and then write a story and then write the draft out and then apply the subgenre thought, right? And apply the niches, apply, oh, where does this sit actually now that I've written this? I think people need to be a bit more intentional when drafting about where their book fits. Daphne, you're really good at this, in my opinion. You're really good at saying, my book, I'm writing a sci-fi romance, right? You know what you're doing when you get into it. You know what tropes you're trying to hit, what characters you're doing. I think that is deeply important for writing a good draft and would eventually writing a book that could be marketable and successful. I think that has a lot to do with it. I know myself, I'm like, I want to write a fantasy book, and then I'll just plop down whatever I'm thinking of without like any thought. Um, and that's, a lot of people are discovery writers like that. I'm not trying to knock it too much, but I do think being intentional could really help when you're trying to edit, when you're trying to solidify your story. If you're like, I don't know what's going to go in this middle section, why don't you look up what other genres have done in the middle section and see what that looks like? Or and analyze, historically many fantasy books tend to slog in the middle to beginning of third act. Why is that? How can we shore up that weakness? You can look at other genres to see, like horror has a knack for constantly ratcheting up the tension so that you don't feel like there's a slog anywhere in the middle. Um, you can see how some of these various elements play together. Some genres don't smash very well together, at least not at first glance, and they might require some more skill or artful work to satisfy genre expectations of conflicting genres such as horror and romance. How do you smash those together? On first glance, you kind of don't, but there are probably ways to do it that would satisfy readers of both genres. Probably more the horror fans than the romance fans, though. I think romance fans tend to be pretty they need a certain trope. It's kind of like, how do you do a happily ever after but also have it be a horror story, right? Um but I do think to that end, setting a hierarchy of genre, like knowing what your main genre is, then applying subgenre trappings can help you really refine your story. And it feels sometimes, I know a lot of people could probably feel like, oh, I'm writing to market. That feels like it's dampening my creativity. But honestly, the best stories that I've read tend to be things that are tailored, like tailored to a specific prompt, but then that writer is very creative at how they address that prompt. If you've ever read writing prompts, the Reddit, some of these stories are just super well constructed based off of a singular prompt. You could say, well, that singular prompt is restricting their creativity. I say creativity thrives under restriction sometimes. I think the to say you can't write this because it's not part of the genre, you go, okay, well, what can I write? What am I going to look for to still satisfy me as the writer, but also meet my genre expectations. Um, I think there are a lot of different places. I'm recommending Jade City again because it draws on mafia crime thrillers and wuxia fantasy, which is martial arts, Chinese inspired. The fifth season by N.K. Jemisin is very much post-apocalyptic fantasy. I talked about that earlier. Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir is sci fantasy and also dark fantasy inspired by necromancy. Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote Planetary Romance, which when I was looking this up, a lot of people talk about how this is a dead genre, so it might be something interesting to explore. Not a lot of people do probably Sword and Planet, Planetary Romance, whatever you want to call it. It could be an interesting place to look at things. And then you have I think Sean, you were talking about the second book, but Legends and Lattes is a cozy fantasy which draws on very specific tropes. Cozy is its own genre.
Yeah, I was just going to throw out that they do, use the medieval world, but
Yeah.
it's like there's not fights in it, like you're exploring people's relationships or hanging out in a coffee shop, I hanging out in a bookstore, but it's just exploring the other. So, I love that of, like not only that you're talking about get out of medieval European fantasy in terms of what your references are, but get out of it in terms of the plots, it doesn't have to be all the same.
Yeah. No, that's definitely like there are various ways to break out of this mold. And it doesn't, if you are thinking, oh, I really should just stay in medieval fantasy or medieval Western European because that's what I know. There are tons of interesting books that are about, like Between Two Fires is kind of like more of a horror take on that, kind of a more dark look at things, but still kind of relying on the historical medieval Western European world. Um, Daphne, you want to talk about fantasy political drama based off West Wing, that would be very cool. You could use those tropes to do something interesting. Like just like, elf, dwarves, the standard stock fantasy stuff that came from Tolkien, which came from Western European mythology, can be used to do other plots that people will be like, oh, I really like that you're doing the West Wing with elves. That sounds fun. Those kinds of mashups can be very, very fun. I also included some analysis books, History of Science Fiction, Horror Unmasked, and also a blog, A Brief History of the Romance Novel. So if you just want to look and see how these things have developed, why things were popular, when they were popular, I think that could be very helpful in determining what kind of story you want to write and where it fits in the canon of everything. Um, I think a lot of people, I was like, why do I want to write fantasy, right? Why has fantasy so enamored me um, for most of my life? Or why are superheroes so enamoring to me? Those are the kinds of questions that you can look at historical stuff and see, oh, well, superheroes are great because a lot of times writers have used them to address social injustice, right? I think that's, and for me, someone who likes those topics, that's a very, that you can go, oh, that's kind of why I like superheroes. Well, how could I write superheroes to address social injustice? Like, how could I use that now that I know that that's kind of like the foundation of an idea? um how's that inform my story? I didn't even talk about, that's the first time I talked about superheroes, and that's really fun. Well, I guess I talked about Superman earlier. Okay, that's the second time I talked about superheroes. uh but I do want to, we are drawing in on the close. And so I want to kind of open up for discussion and say, what kind of ideas would you like to incorporate or have incorporated into your works that don't align with this Western European fantasy mold? And then now that you've kind of looked at it, what ideas do align that you might not have been aware of? I think a lot of people, we talk about elves and dwarves, right? Not a lot of people really think too much about it when using them, but that just straight up comes from Tolkien, which straight up comes from his studies of, he drew it from Norse sources, from Welsh sources. Didn't really, and people kind of get that disconnect. They get it from Tolkien and then they don't kind of look at the cultures that come from that. But I'll open it up. I'm gonna put the floor open.
I feel like most medieval fantasy Western European ideas do have a lot of wars, but don't necessarily focused on like the ideas of like crusades the same way.
Hmm.
Which I think would be an interesting way to explore part of that. Um, but someone earlier when I was asking about Renaissance versus medieval was talking about the idea of like how far does the world expand? So with medieval, you have, the current lord and whatever lands are around him, but then if you start getting into like trade routes and like political alliances and things like that, it starts to get more complicated, and that's when you get further into the history.
I see, Shan, you say you draw on Inuit cosmology for your Arctic fantasy stories. That sounds pretty fascinating, actually.
anything. I'm a sucker for anything that's like Latin American or South American mythology.
Hmm.
Those any of those cultures, I would love to just live in those fantasy worlds.
I almost put Karente Yoshimida into the chat as like a recommended out of. I She does a lot of Latin American and let's say like American contemporary culture things, but it's I oh, what's the word? It's fantastic realism. And not exactly, what you're thinking of. But very much love how she blends different genres into what, like you would expect, from even a novel that has fantastic realism in it. I just doing things about, like LA during a traffic jam and strange things about the world that are fantastic, but much more of today. So it didn't exactly put that in.
Hmm. Well, any other commentary people would like to add? See, a lot of people are talking in the chat. The influence of the church in medieval fantasy. It's kind of an interesting topic, and I do think religion is an interesting aspect to explore in stories. One, I think when you see a lot of medieval fantasy, there's a tendency to crystal dragon Jesus things, where you just make like a something that resembles the church in medieval Europe, and then you don't actually really build anything interesting about it because people, those are some of those questions, right, about like death that you can go back to culturally, like why, what did people think about death and what comes after? What do they think about the soul? That's kind of
I think
uh
you have to decide what elements you want to explore and what ones you want to shorthand,
yeah,
right? So, like, in the book I was reading just recently, it explores pretty deeply this society's feelings on death and like what happens after you die, how you do funeral rites and things like that. But they kind of just hand wavy away food, right? Like food's there,
yeah,
but they don't explore it. It's definitely not something like that's been fully in depth thought through in the world. And so it depends on like what aspects of it you want to like explore, right? So there's people that get all up in arms when people include weird fantasy creatures for them to ride instead of having just horses. Well, it depends. Do you want to like focus on that aspect or not? Uh,
yeah,
so as well as thinking about your three pillars, right? The medieval, the time period, or the time period, the genre, and the location, like as well as like what aspects do you want to think about? Do you want to think deeply about what the religion looks like in your religious in your the fantasy world, or do you want to know that it's there and just kind of leave it alone because it's not important to your story?
yeah. And I mean, you can, like you said, you can shorthand some things and not others, right? And I think it's about like what your story is about will help inform that. Like if your story is about religion, then I think absolutely you should not be shorthanding to the standard medieval fantasy church stuff. But if you're, doing a different kind of story, having something that is in the background informs, that is it's not as important to not to build it out as widely. But I think that's why the questionnaire is helpful. Even if you don't, you can still have an answer to the question, right? So I think we've had a lot of conversation today. I hope that you have been left with some interesting ideas for how to break out of um, medieval Western European fantasy. And thank you for your time. Uh, I think this is probably we're about out of time. So, what is next week for Writer's Lunch?
Next week, Shannon is going to be talking about doing marketing research for your story. I don't know if Shannon's busy right now or if you can give us a little preview.
Yeah, well, I can't turn on the the camera, but we'll be talking about doing market research. As you said, this is an important process for you, regardless of how you're planning to publish, because it's important to know your comp titles and the market that you're trying to put your book in when you try to sell it to an agent, or even for the agent search process. But then also, especially if you are indie or looking for a medium or small press to take on your book, you need to know what your publisher is going to have to do with it, or what you're going to have to do with it as a publisher to get it noticed in the market. So we'll be talking about a lot of things. We'll go into depth on a couple of things, and hopefully this will help you get your book published.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for spending time with us. Hope y'all have a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday, right?
Thank you, Ian. Heck yeah.
Ian.
Thank you,
On
Ian.
to August.